Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Daniel Bardenstein. Daniel, thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. I was trying to think about this morning, like when we met. I feel like it was like 3 years ago, roughly, at RSA, at like a happy hour that was hosted by, Dr. Alan Friedman and crew. The S-bomb crew, I'd call it, I guess. But for folks that don't know you, don't know the Manifest team, can you tell us a bit about yourself and the team too?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the CTO and co-founder of a software supply chain startup called Manifest. My background in brief, I like to joke I've been building enterprise security tools for most of my career. Needed a break from private sector and jumped over to public sector for a little bit. Spent 4 to 5 years leading large-scale cybersecurity projects in government, including some work that directly led to the formation of the Manifest company and product, one of which being one of the cybersecurity co-leads for Operation Warp Speed, which is the US government's efforts to rapidly develop, distribute, and administer COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics. And in general, just all around enthusiast for cybersecurity, national security, trying to make the lives easier for those who are on the front lines, trying to protect us in digital and cyberspace.
That's awesome. I know you all are particularly passionate about software supply chain security. That's kind of how you and I came into touch, several years ago now. But when we look at the rise of like AI, for example, what are some of the risks that are the same or different when we think about open source, in the context of now AI and the rise of LLMs and Gen AI and things that we've seen happen over the last several years?
Yeah, I think one of the big points I find myself repeating over and over these days is that AI security, or AI is a subset of software. Therefore, AI security is a subset of software security. So when we talk to security leaders around the world in government and private sector, looking at the onslaught of AI that's kind of proliferating in their organizations and trying to figure out how do they get their arms around how they're going to take on the AI security burden in the programs, I almost try to reassure them that 90% of what you're already doing for your software supply chain or your software security program almost certainly applies to what you're going to need to do for AI security. And there's a lot more overlap than people think. So open source is a great example. So most security practitioners are familiar with the open source problem. We use lots of open source libraries. Open source represents some amount of risk. Obviously people love to point out log4j or xzutils or polyfill. There's, lots of good canonical examples. But at the end of the day, we're bringing in code into our applications and products and enterprises that other people wrote. So we need to understand who are those people? Can we trust them? Are there security risks in the code, either traditional vulnerabilities, legal or business risks like licensing, or any malicious behaviors, like is there some backdoor that's exfiltrating data to some random IP address? Is it monitored? Is it end of life, etc.? All those questions apply to, you can still call it open source, though I've been corrected many times. The correct term would be open weight models or, publicly available data sets, right? At the end of the day, in AI land, when we're using open weight models, and that could be things that are on Hugging Face, for example, right? Like what GitHub is for software, Hugging Face is for AI infrastructure, models, and data sets. So the same questions apply. If I want to use a Meta Llama model that's on Hugging Face, obviously I know it's made by Meta, and I might have more trust in Meta than I do if it's a random developer somewhere in the world who made a random model. You need to understand how it was built, where it came from. Are there any legal risks to it? Are there any security risks to it? And you want to implement those same protections like you would, do we review OSS before we bring it in? Do we have a canonical list of approved or pinned versions that we use, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the main differences between how we think about open source as it pertains to software versus AI. Firstly, the quality and quantity of data that we have on the AI side is significantly less and worse than we do on the software side of the house. So, think of GitHub and package managers, tons of data, highly structured, lots of APIs. On the AI side of the house, long story short is the data quality and accessibility is a lot lower. So it makes our job harder. And the other big example is that the legal risk in a lot of cases is bigger for AI. So to tell a quick anecdote here, one of our early design partners building our AI platform, when they look at evaluating whether they can use an open weight model, they are looking at every single data set that was used to train that model, trying to extract the license of that data set and make sure that there's no legal obstacle for them to actually use that model because the data set was gotten illegally or might come from a questionable place, etc. So I think one of the main differences that people should be thinking about is that there's actually bigger business or legal risk to using open weight AI than when it comes to traditional open source software. And also, just to make sure, Chris, are you still there? I saw you blank out for a sec. Are you still with me?
Yeah. No, my signal. Yeah, I'm still here. My signal dropped a little bit. I caught everything you said, and you raised some great points. I think of it the same way. Like you mentioned, kind of like open source, but in the context of AI, we've seen rise of Hugging Face as like a community, right, where people are going and contributing models. And the big difference for folks to keep in mind here is like some of the leading frontier models by proprietary vendors. They don't have open weights. You don't necessarily know what the model was trained on, the weights of the model, and so on. But there is a large plethora of, open source models out there that people are using for a variety of purposes. And those open source software risks are still relevant, in the context of AI, just like they are in open source software. And actually made me think of the next question I was going to ask you is, you and I, again, we met back in the day around SBOM, for example, and now there's a rise of this term, AI bomb. For folks not familiar with AI bomb, what is that exactly, and how does it relate to SBOM? How is it different? How can folks use it?
Yeah. So first, I'm contractually obligated through my friendship with Dr. Alan Friedman to specify that there's some different names for this thing. So some people call it an AI bomb, an AI bill of materials. Some people call it an AI SBOM. I believe CISO has been calling it SBOM for AI. At the end of the day, to distinguish what this thing is and what is not, an AI SBOM, as I typically call them, it is an SBOM used to describe an AI system. So a specific model, the data set's trained on it, or an AI-enabled piece of software. It is important to distinguish that it is not, as some people might think, an AI-generated SBOM. So even taking away the concept of the SBOM for a second, ultimately what we need to have is some sort of common taxonomy and terminology to talk about models and data sets and AI-related infrastructure. So I know sometimes when I say AI SBOM or AI bomb, people think, oh, you've taken two buzzwords and you've smushed them together. But really what we're hoping to do is take the benefits of the SBOM, which is that it's highly structured, it's consistent, it's universally accepted, and use that to describe all this new AI infrastructure. And so why is this important and why is it needed? A lot of AI practitioners will rightly point to model cards and data cards and say, hey, well, we already have a way to describe what's in a model and a data set. But those same strengths I mentioned for bills of material lack in model cards, right? Meta's model card looks completely different from model cards that you'd see on Hugging Face, look completely different from NVIDIA's model card. And so at the end of the day, if I'm an AI security practitioner or a security practitioner, what do I need to do? I need automation, I need tooling, I need to interact with my data in an automated, easy way. I need to search, I need to filter, I need to alert, I need to scan. In order to do that, I need data in a common normalized format, right? That's how SIMs work, that's how all of our network and big data tools work. And so what the AI SBOM attempts to do is define what is the common format that we can use to talk about and exchange information about models and data sets and the related software, so that at the end of the day, it's not just so we have a new piece of JSON flying around the internet. It's to make the lives of security practitioners easier, because now they have a piece of data that they can put into a system or point a scanner at that can make their work easier and more actionable, so they can automatically scan licenses and vulns and lineage for models. The alternative, which is the status quo, is reading lots of websites. So if you really enjoy spending all of your time reading Hugging Face and reading model cards and typing things into some sort of ERP or whatever system, would highly recommend AI SBOMs as a more automated, structured approach to trying to make your lives a lot faster and easier.
Yeah, I think especially in these early days where you talked about the lack of standardization around model cards, different vendors, how they might provide, approach this level of transparency, what they will or won't disclose. Like, having a capability like an AI bomb is helpful, and it makes sense. Like when you think about SBOM, it's the same kind of concept in terms of understanding, what you're consuming, what you're using, the pedigree, the provenance, what's inside the risks associated with it, and so on. But when we think about these AI models, why is it so difficult? In some cases, even like I talked about this a little bit between the proprietary vendor models and open source ecosystem, but even then, it's difficult sometimes to get visibility of, dependencies, the pedigree and provenance, the training data sets, and so on. Like, why is it such a difficult task to try to get that transparency around these things?
Yeah, it's a great question. Right now, with how model cards and data cards are generated, it's really about how much effort whoever made the model is putting into providing it, right? And so, for example, you can go to Hugging Face and you can look at some models where there's a robust set of information that say where this, the base model or parent model that they use, the training data sets, all the steps they used, the performance metrics, etc. And you see some models that don't have anything. So it's really a question of data availability. Like, did somebody take the time to type all of this stuff out? And again, that's where we want to get to with AI SBOMs and beyond SBOMs, just automating the generation of this related information. And that kind of goes to the second gap, which is tooling, right? So even if we had information about these models and data sets, most organizations don't have the right tooling and that takes the data from one place out on the internet and puts it somewhere internally that they can start to operationalize. So we're dependent on other people to literally type out information about their models and data sets, which they don't always take the time to do. And then even then, most organizations lack the tools to take those model card data, that data card data out on the open internet and bring it in internally so they can start automating it. And one thing I forgot to mention on the previous question, one hat I wear outside of my role at Manifest, I'm one of the co-leads of the AI SBOM Tiger team under CISO, basically the working group. And literally last week, we finally published a list of AI SBOM use cases. And I'll happily to send over the link on GitHub. I believe it's the AI Bomb Squad is the name of the GitHub organization, but we'll make sure to share the link out with the listeners. But we've spent the last 9 months or so working on articulating what the key use cases are for AI SBOMs so that security practitioners can understand how does this help me out, but also to better inform our leaders on why they should be thinking, what risks they should be thinking about when it comes to AI security, why AI SBOMs can help with some of those things, but also pointing out the limits of AI SBOMs, because any sort of SBOM, whether it's AI or hardware or traditional software bomb, they're not going to solve all of your security problems, right? And so we finally published this doc. You either have a long PDF or some helpful markdown files on GitHub that we encourage the community to look at and provide feedback on.
Yeah, a few things there you said. So I've had a guest on previously. I'm curious if she collaborates with you on this. Helen Oakley, is she part of that group?
She is one of my esteemed co-leads for the.
Okay, I had a feeling, when we're talking AI bomb, I had her on previously. She's great, and she dug deep in this topic too. Another thing you talked about there is like it takes someone typing this information in, right, to provide that transparency around the model and what's in there, training data sets, et cetera, around model and data cards. And a good point to raise here, just like open source software, these are not your vendors. Like you can make any demands of them you like, but they're not required to provide you these things. You're choosing to go out and use these things on the internet, freely available, for example, in the context of open source. So having an AI bomb is going to give you that type of insight, without necessarily needing to go and get the information from the maintainer, who is in no position to necessarily give you this, whether you want it or not. You don't have a contractual relationship with them like you will with a proprietary, vendor or software vendor of some sort. So I'm curious, like, you're out there interacting in this space, leading these working groups and so on. When you're chatting with CISOs or security leaders, a lot of them are trying to just get a handle on like, hey, where do I get started? I'm trying to understand what AI we're using, trying to wrangle on like, where are we using it? How are we using it? What's it being used for? What data is it accessing or being trained on? Those kind of things. Where do you recommend folks get started? And also, what are some, when you interact with folks, like, and you hear some kind of approaches that make you go, oh, that's not, the best way to go about doing this?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a couple of anecdotes for both. So I think one of the best things that people can do to get started is to actually implement a centralized approval process and inventory. So in order for anyone to use whatever model or data set internally, you need to go through some approval process that goes through. I've seen a lot of organizations have like an AI review board, it's a combination of security and legal or compliance and some other folks, and they adjudicate yes or no. And then if it's yes, it gets added to some central inventory. So having just that process by which people across different business units or different parts of the organization, they have to request, it goes through a central pipeline. Again, you can automate, doesn't have to be an annual process. Hey, I want to use this model. Here's the use case I need it for. And and then it goes to this centralized place where you can hopefully in the future automate the analysis of this model and answer a lot of these questions. And then if it gets approval, you have some sort of inventory that you can reference into enforcement off of. I think that's, the strongest first step. And then closely followed by, enforcement and detection, right? So how do you, one of the new accurate buzzwords in this space is shadow AI, right? So with the democratization of AI, it just takes a developer in one of your business units who knows Python to import Hugging Face Hub, repo ID equals DeepSeek, whatever it is, Hugging Face Hub download, download DeepSeek. So how do you actually go out and detect and enforce people trying to bring in things that aren't part of that inventory, that aren't part of that approval process? So I think that's one of the most important things that organizations can do. And on some of the mistakes that we've seen, we still see organizations that don't do anything. We see some organizations where the process is totally manual. And even from some of the largest IT and tech companies in the world, it's a 6-week process to go from, hey, somebody in this business unit wants to use this model. How do we thoroughly work up our analysis to get to yes or no? 6 weeks is a long time if you want to race to AI and get adoption and get new products out the door, right? I'll give an example from a very large kind of health tech company that we've worked with, where the engineering leadership wants to take advantage of the latest and greatest in generative AI and LLMs, and gave every developer budget to go use whatever AI tool they wanted per month. And so then you have the CISO saying, well, we barely have a sense of what every developer is doing, how they're doing it, and what models are they using, and are they doing it directly via a tool like Cursor or Claude Desktop, or are they going rogue and using some MCPs, which is basically like a new covert channel to go, access certain models. And so having that centralized process, having people go through a certain way to make sure that models and data sets are adjudicated consistently, start an inventory, and then use that as the basis for enforcement is usually what we find to be the most productive set of steps for CISOs and security teams that are trying to wrangle the AI security beast.
Yeah, what I love about the answer that you just gave is, on one hand, if you've been doing cybersecurity for some time, like, oh, I'm familiar with some of these steps because it's long-standing, trusted, traditional approaches like hardware, software, asset inventories, like CIS top critical controls, and it has been for years and years, right? But there's also new novel attack vectors when you think about the open source community around the AI models, where the model providers in the proprietary sense training on your data, how is it being brought into the enterprise through developers? There's some new things to consider too. So it's like, it's not just, the same old. There's some new novel things to keep in mind here as well. And to your point, these approval timelines, like on one hand, having a centralized inventory and an approval process is key, but we all know, we've worked in enterprise environments, like, 6 weeks is a long time. Chances are someone's doing something that they're not waiting for 6 weeks. They're going to be going out there, starting to use something, put enterprise and organizational data in there. And you have to have visibility of these kind of things, to be able to manage those risks appropriately. So speaking about the tools that you talked about, kind of having these tools for visibility, transparency, inventory and things like that. AI is disproportionately dominating the landscape when we look at venture funding, startups, even the incumbents that are now rallying around AI and MCP and all the things, right? It's kind of all the talk of the ecosystem, even in cyber. What are you seeing in that ecosystem when you look at the vendors out there? What are some of the gaps you're seeing that others might be missing? And how does Manifest, approach this differently than some of the others in your space?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a lot of AI security startups coming up, and they're out there. And I'm, as you mentioned, and I'm friends with some of the people who started some of these companies. And my personal take is a lot of the companies out there are going after these, what I like to describe as the sexy AI problems, right? So you might be looking at things like AI specific vulnerabilities like pickle deserialization attacks. You might be looking for things like detecting prompt injection or more performance things like hallucination or data poisoning. All these are really important. At the same time, I liken this a lot to 0 days in traditional software and security, right? 0 days are very exciting. They're very sexy. But if you talk to any security practitioner, 0 days are not a small segment of what security looks like at the enterprise, right? It is how do we know what software we're using? How do we have asset inventory? How do we make sure that we have a secure CI pipeline and we're detecting vulnerabilities? How are we doing continuous monitoring? It's all the less sexy stuff. And so where we're trying to differentiate and where we've focused on building our platform, meeting the needs of our early design partners, is on that 90% of what we think of traditional cybersecurity programs. It's going to become will become 90% of AI risk management programs or AI security programs. And again, a couple of examples here. Talking with some of our design partners, again, across healthcare, financial services, defense, and IT and tech. How do we get that 6-week process down to 2 clicks, which is something we're able to do. So here's a model. Let me pop into the new AI risk tool, and then I get a structured representation of everything I know about this model or data set, including stuff that you wouldn't actually see on Hugging Face. How do I set custom policies and scan those policies and get a definition of risk based on my internal custom risk analysis and policies? And then how do I either export the report to share with someone or actually initiate an approval process, right? So how can I have somebody in a business unit look at a model, request the model, comes to a central queue, show that risk analysis, adjudicate findings, approve it, and get that down to a minute versus 6 weeks? That's a huge amount of time savings. And the other thing that we're focused on beyond just solving the beneath the surface iceberg of AI security programs is the integration of AI security and software security. I think the stat I remember from, it's probably 10 years ago at this point, was that the average enterprise security team has between 30 to 40 enterprise security tools. I'm sure that number's probably gone up. The last thing a CISO or security person wants to hear is, oh, now I need to double that number because now I need an AI flavor of each of those tools I have. But ultimately, especially when we think about supply chain, again, I'll say it again, AI is a subset of software. Like, even if you have a great model, it's not going to live in a vacuum. You need to deploy it into software in order for it to be used. And so with what Manifest has already been doing on traditional software supply chain security, helping organizations understand the code that they write, making sure it's secure before it hits production, and then intelligently and automatically respond to new vulnerabilities or incidents once things are out there. And on the third-party side, we are procuring software. How do we understand what's in the software our vendors are trying to sell us? All of that applies to AI. So it makes a lot of sense to have a central platform where if I'm procuring a Cisco router, Zoom for desktop, whatever it is for my vendors, I have one place that assesses the software and AI risk of that tool. And if I'm building an AI-enabled app internally, I have one place where I can assess the supply chain and the dependencies and the licenses and the lineage of all the software and AI in this AI-enabled app that I'm going to then go and sell or deploy internally. So ultimately, again, it's about how do you focus on the bulk of what an AI risk management program will look like, and how do you integrate software security risk and AI risk into one tool? Because otherwise, we're going to have more niche point solutions that don't communicate, and we all know that security people already deal with that problem every day.
Yeah, you're about to send me down a rant, but I wrote an article, I don't know, it's been like 3 or 4 months ago now, but the enterprise security tool tech stack is actually in the hundreds or several hundreds at large enterprise environments. And in many cases, like when you look at what's being exploited, for example, last year, like a lot of these were security tools themselves that were being exploited and impacting the enterprise. And it's, the tools are actually causing more problems than they're solving in some cases. That's why I loved in your answer there, the emphasis around one tool for software and AI, because especially in the context of like the examples you use, Zoom and others, there are software vendors that are rolling out AI capabilities in their product. So it's not bifurcated where you track it separately. It's like all in one place. Another topic, again, we kind of started on this topic of SBOM, but you guys are at the forefront of SBOMs and folks using software bill of materials. And it's a polarizing topic. Some in the community are like, SBOMs don't work. We don't need SBOMs, blah, blah, blah. Like, they point out all the problems that they can think of with the formats or whatever thing, anything they can think of. And others are like, this is obvious. Like, we should know what's in the software we're using. Like, this is, and I'm kind of in that camp, not to say that it's perfect and there aren't issues, but like, we should know what we're using. This is pretty a simple concept. We are at the forefront of SBOM. When you think about this and you're working with enterprises, how do organizations go about operationalizing SBOMs from a risk management perspective, from a procurement perspective? How are they actually using SBOMs in practice?
Yeah, it is the $1 million question here. So to your point about agreeing, there's mixed views and different views on SBOMs. I think it's really important for people to remember that SBOMs are not the goal, right? Any sort of bill of material, it's just a list of JSON stuff. So it's how do you use and operationalize SBOMs for particular use cases. So I typically break things into first party and third party. So for first party, when you're writing code, you can use SBOMs as a something easier and more robust way to operationalize and kind of modernize your SCA practices, right? So how are you accurately describing and inventorying third-party dependencies? How are you doing the enrichment on what those things are? It's a common data format to help, especially a lot of organizations modernize traditional SCA, and not just scanning code or pull requests as they're happening, because we have tools that do that, but it's the persistence of that information, so that when something happens down the road, your software supply chain security vulnerability or incident, you can make it easier to respond. And again, not to beat the dead horse of Log4 Shell, but for most organizations out there who've had SCA tools who are scanning their code, many of them, those tools are legacy and have been around for 10 to 15 years. Most organizations still had a hard time with not only Log4 Shell, but even the more recent cases. When we talk to organizations, when polyfill was happening, when exautils was happening, and we'd say, hey, how would you understand where across your entire internal inventory you're using any versions of these libraries? And they said, we don't know. We don't have a centralized inventory that we can accurately query. So again, SBOMs aren't the goal, but if you store them, you search, filter, query, all of our big data verbs, it makes it a lot easier to enable outcomes like faster and automated vulnerability response, like compliance requests when you're submitting documentation to the federal government or DoD or the FDA or the Department of Commerce for automotive stuff. On the third party side, I think actually the operationalization is even easier and almost less technical, which is organizations should be demanding SBOMs from their vendors. And why is that so important? In the first party use case, you have access to your own source code, right? So you can look as deep down as you want. SBOMs are just a great format to store things, to talk about things, to exchange them between tools, but ultimately you've got the source code. On the third party side, your vendors aren't going to give you their source code, but oftentimes they will give you their SBOMs, particularly if that's a requirement for the contract. And we see this even with Wall Street banks who, despite being a very highly regulated industry, don't yet have regulation around SBOMs, and yet almost every major bank we speak with is developing an internal SBOM program for the stuff they're building and demanding SBOMs from their vendors. And obviously, as you can imagine, people find much better uptake on SBOMs when it's a contractual requirement. So especially on the third-party risk side, those security practitioners have less data, right? They're going after vendor risk questionnaires, those big Excel spreadsheets that we all hate, and it's a lot of manual process. And whether or not my supplier gives their users annual security awareness trainings is a separate issue from what is the risk I'm taking on by taking and buying your tool and putting it in my environment. And without having source code, the SBOM is one of the only options, and if not the best ways, to get empirical data about the security risk of that application. To your point, it's not perfect. It's not the same as getting source code, but in terms of what you're going to reliably get from your supplier, that's it. So for TPRM or CSCRM teams, putting language into their contracts that require SBOMs, and we see that this continue to grow across government and private sector. And then ultimately you need tooling, right? Like having a JSON artifact in your email isn't going to make you more secure. How do you have a way to scan, organize, store, continuously monitor these SBOMs so that when a vulnerability or incident affects one of your suppliers, you're aware of it almost as soon as they are, and you can put into places those mitigations. You can tag asset owners, you can wait for patches, you can go quarantine something on the network while the supplier is providing you the patch.
Yeah, you said a few things that I want to highlight. For some reason, again, to the polarization around the SBOM, is some of the naysayers and detractors like, well, what about this scenario? And it's like, no one ever said that this was a silver bullet. And we don't look at any other approach in security and say, well, this will stop all the things. And it's like, no one said that about SBOM. It's just a level of transparency to understand, hey, when I buy a product from a vendor, what's in it? Or if I'm using open source, where do I have dependencies in the software that I'm running that are vulnerable, perhaps? If there's an incident, where do I have an understanding of where it's at in the enterprise, right? And like, I love the emphasis around working with your vendors to, start to integrate this into your procurement or your CSCRM processes, because it's moving from the kind of tell me what you're doing via a 250 question questionnaire that I just trust. Like it's ironic too, because we're in this phase of zero trust, like no implicit trust, but we'll take a questionnaire and say, yeah, the vendor said they're doing X, Y, and Z. It's like, no, don't tell me, show me. Show me what's in your software and show me the residual risk of the software that you're selling me. And that's why I love that concept of the SBOM in that regard. So you actually answered my next question a little bit to some extent. Is I was going to ask you, when it comes to AI bomb, we talked about Hugging Face and open source models and things like that, and I can see where that's pretty easily accessible or easy to create for some scenarios. But there's a lot of proprietary frontier model providers as well, and you may not be able to get an AI bomb just by wanting it. You might have to ask them. You may be able to bake it into your procurement processes and so on. Those kind of things. Contractual language. Like when it comes to working with proprietary vendors, how do you recommend folks approach the concept of an AI bomb? Is it very similar to SBOM, where it's procurement, contractual, those kind of things? And how are you seeing that kind of materialize?
Yeah. So when a lot of organizations, the first step on their AI journey is to just use a foundation model out of the box, right? Like I'm just going to use a GPT model, a Claude model, a Gemini model. And obviously, again, I'm not going to raise a false alarm by saying, oh, don't trust OpenAI or Meta or Anthropic, right? Your overall risk using those models is relatively low. And so we don't want to point anybody in a false direction. But where things become important on security is, still maintaining that inventory of which of the models are we approved to use internally, and where are they being used? Again, so that if something happens in the future, maybe OpenAI loses a lawsuit in the future. Who knows? So far, they seem to be winning all their recent ones for their data collection. But if something happens to a future GPT model and you need to know where in the organization you're using it, you can answer that in a question. Again, inventory is still key. It's the foundation of any security program. CISOs and other security leaders need to know which models are being used, where, for what use cases, and the enterprise, in a way that should be a search type result, and not let me phone call and email all of my engineering and data science leads and have them put it to a spreadsheet. For the more advanced organizations out there, they might start with approved foundation models, for their initial use cases, but pretty soon they're going to start fine tuning and customizing those models, right? So I might start with a base of Claude 4 Sonnet, but then I'm going to throw custom data at it for my enterprise, and because I want to get a really fine tuned, dedicated model that is really good for my internal use case. But then that becomes a new artifact. That's a new piece of software, a new piece of AI. So how are you tracking that model, right? This data scientist in this business unit in Databricks, MLflow, SageMaker started with Claude 4 Sonnet, threw this data at it. Here's the name of the data, the license of the data, what data contains. They're using it for this use case. Here's how they trained it. Here are the hyperparameters, whatever else. How do you represent that information before it gets lost into the void? Again, a bill of materials, a great way to do that, right? And some of the tooling that we have built, we actually have a Python plugin that can go right in front of data scientists. So as they are fine-tuning models that are purpose-built, even if they're based off of Claude or GPT or Gemini models, you can still say, hey, I have a record of Daniel's model that started from GPT-4o and had these custom data sets and were trained in this way. And so now we have a record of it. We know which product or application it's deployed in. And so again, even if you don't need to, you're not worried as much about the risk of the foundation models themselves. You still need to have the inventory about where and how they're being used. You need to be able to have artifacts and track where they're being customized, fine-tuned, quantized, adapted, etc. internally in the enterprise for all the reasons we talked about before.
Yeah, it's a great answer. I also shared something here on the screen, and I'll put it in the show notes, is your guys' link to a GitHub repository around AI bomb, because folks had brought up a question around where can they find more about the AI bomb use cases and things of that nature. So I want to drop that in there for folks too.
Yeah, I actually, let me, it has since moved. I don't know. Let me drop it. I don't know if I can put it in the comments or something, or what the easiest way.
Yeah, no worries. I can drop it in the show notes too.
Yeah,
I'll grab it here.
I put it in the I think the backstage chat. So
yeah, I'll get it. I got it. I'll share it with folks.
So the link you're sharing below, we wrote a white paper at this point about a year ago around the initial idea around an AI bomb and how it can be used. So that's a lot of manifest research. And then the second link that we will make sure everybody has access to are those CISA AI SBOM working group use cases. So folks should definitely peruse both, and we're always happy to answer questions that people have.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll also share not only in show notes, but I'll share that link in my newsletter tomorrow for folks that follow along on there. So my last question for you is, we've kind of talked about all the technical topics, the models, the ways proprietary versus open source. There's also this looming regulatory kind of compliance aspect around AI. On one hand, there's the U.S. where we had some executive orders around AI, for example. Those have kind of been rescinded with the new administration, and we're kind of waiting to see the direction that we go. We have discussions around regulatory moratoriums around AI in the states here, but in the EU, for example, it's a much different approach with things like the EU AI Act and more kind of rigorous approaches to AI regulation. What are your thoughts around how those two entities, the U.S. and EU, are approaching this topic? And when you think about AI bomb, S bomb, are you seeing demand in one country or region versus the other? And if it's within the U.S., I know I'm throwing a lot of questions at you, but if it's within the U.S., what sectors in particular are you seeing kind of more demand for S bombs and AI bombs and these kind of transparency artifacts?
Yeah, all great questions. So let's start with the EU first. As is kind of traditional or classic, the EU is they have much stronger language, with much higher penalties. But their organizations are a little bit behind the ball from a lot of the U.S. companies, both on traditional DevSecOps pipelines and as well as to some extent AI. But the organizations in the EU know that the regulations are serious. For example, I believe not the EU AI Act, but I believe it's the Cyber Resilience Act. The penalties for EU companies, it's whichever is greater of 15 million euros or 2.5% of global revenue, which is serious. Like, I can't imagine the U.S. ever imposing those sorts of penalties on domestic companies. And so organizations know, the CRA and the EU AI Act are serious, and they're lining up to get ready. And I believe last week Anthropic announced, I think I saw a headline, Anthropic announced that it plans to adhere to the standards in the EU AI Act, which includes stuff around transparency and security. And I think just like with software, for a lot of these big AI players, we'll see transparency and security be a differentiator in the market, right? Why Meta's been putting their stuff on Hugging Face and open sourcing, open weighting them. And then Anthropic, is trying to communicate that desire and willingness to be transparent as well. So I think people certainly want the business in the EU, and I think that will definitely cause an uptick in transparency and security, even for these foundation models, which is great. In the US, we'll talk adoption first, then we can talk about AI. And adoption, certainly the more regulated entities are leaning into this stuff first, as you can imagine. So healthcare, when it comes to FDA and HHS ONC requirements. You've got automotive when it comes to Department of Commerce's BIS requirements around SBOMs. You've got defense or anyone selling into U.S. government. So the organizations that see both carrot and stick are definitely leaning ahead into all these things. So again, like I mentioned with the Wall Street banks, they're not under any regulation to collect SBOMs, generate SBOMs, do this sort of supply chain analysis. They just think it's good practice, and so they're going ahead and do it. Interestingly, in the U.S., a lot's happening on the AI regulation front. So obviously, with the change of administration, there was a change of the executive orders around AI. But even in this current administration's OMB memos, there are callouts for making sure that risk mitigation is done on the rapid adoption of AI. It mentions specifically elements around transparency, data lineage. We know from the tenor of the current U.S. administration that one of the biggest concerns here is competition with China. So you can certainly expect to see more of if you're going to sell an AI-enabled tool to the U.S. government, you must prove that there's no Chinese nexus to the tool you're using. So no DeepSeek is how we like to joke about that, which again, more of a deceptively difficult problem than people think of. If somebody in your organization wants to use a model, how do you know if they didn't just derive it from DeepSeek, which has happened, and we have some fun stories about. But there's also a growing trend, and we see some of this. There's actually language in the latest version of the NDAA, which is Congress's budget for defense, that basically says anywhere in U.S. policy that talks about SBOM, it must include any AI in that software as part of the compliance package. So organizations that are under any sort of software supply chain transparency requirements will soon need to answer for the AI that everyone is going to be shoving into their tools. And we also just see, I think even again, I think it was in the last week or two, a bipartisan bill was put forward in the US Congress around AI transparency and security. So we actually see, despite all the gridlock in Washington, some agreement on, at least at the federal level, AI transparency and security. So this is clearly something that everyone's taking seriously. The big AI companies are working together with these efforts. But ultimately, this is going to, at least the hope is, going to significantly improve the security, resilience, and transparency of both foundation models and how they're being built and used. And then also anyone who's expecting to procure and use AI-enabled software, they need to be able to understand these risks as well.
Yeah, I wasn't tracking some of those developments in terms of the language of the NDAA around inclusion of AI, components and so on tied to software and SBOM. So that's great to hear. And I did see that headline from Anthropic. And to your point, I think some of the leading frontier model providers are leaning into that. They know security organizations, like security leaders at organizations, I should say, or even just security conscious buyers in general, want to understand, the risks associated with the models that they're starting to use and bake into business processes. So they are going to look to use, I think, that transparency as a competitive differentiator, right, in the market of, being forward leaning on that front. So all great points. So we've really run the gamut of a broad conversation on the regulatory front, the technical front, the models, proprietary, SBOM, you name it. For folks that want to learn more about you, Manifest Cyber, what do you guys have coming up next that we should keep an eye on? Those kind of things. Anything you want to throw out there?
Yeah, so we are rolling out Enforce to Black Hat, which for those who are willing to make the trek to Vegas in the summer, people are more welcome to come by and swing by the booth and say hello. That's what we'll also be unveiling our new AI risk platform, which we've been basically talking about throughout today. So we want to bring that same level of, again, on the SBOM side, how do I generate these things? How do I analyze? How do I store? How do I continuously monitor my software? Into the AI realm. So, if people are starting to think about, well, how do I take those first steps into building my AI risk management program? This is why we're building the platform we've built in conjunction with some of the world's largest, companies across sectors to help them address their pain points. And otherwise, people should definitely check out the site, and there's a lot of content upcoming, and reach out. The AI risk platform will be giving out kind of free pilots of that. So if people are interested in actually getting hands-on this new novel capability around the space, we welcome early adopters and people who are willing to give it a try, poke around, and hopefully actually use it internally for their enterprise AI security processes. But otherwise, meet us at Black Hat. We got lots of conferences coming up, and always feel free to reach out to the website. We're always happy to chat with people and understand the problems and pain points they're going after when it comes to traditional software supply chain security, AI security. And ultimately, like I said at the beginning, our passion is making the lives easier, those who are actually on the front lines of securing our software and AI. So if that's you listening out there, our job is to help make your life easier, so you don't have to miss Christmas for Log4Shell. You can use the weekend with your kid, stay with your kid and hang out with your kids over the weekend and not have to jump on for the next AI incident that will come up.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate the conversation. I'll say, I've been connected to you for several years, and we met in person again at RSA several years back. But you're always out there engaging in thoughtful conversation on LinkedIn and platforms like that around these topics. And appreciate you diving deep. You heard it. Check out the Manifest booth at Black Hat if you're going, and keep an eye out for their AI risk platform as well. So Daniel, thanks so much for jumping on, man.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Excellent. Have a good afternoon.